debates. We've heard from a number of fascinating and inspiring speakers. But wait, there's still more. There's still more. And I am thrilled to be able to introduce our last speaker of the convention. It's the last item on our agenda, but it's his first speech to New Democrats since he was elected our leader not too long ago. And you know who that is. In 2007, Thomas Mulcair accepted Jack Layton's invitation to become his Quebec lieutenant. Now, they were both convinced at that time that the NDP represented the values of Quebec. And they were right. Tom was first elected as the MP for Outremont in the 2007 by-election. And as we all know, he was re-elected in 2008 and 2011. He was the first NDP MP in the province of Quebec to be elected in a general election ever. And of course, that traditional Liberal stronghold is now the home of the Orange Crush. Backed by a strong NDP team, Jack and Thomas Mulcair worked tirelessly to help create a spectacular breakthrough in Quebec on May 2nd of last year. Making absolutely. And we know what that did, right? It made Canada's New Democrats the official opposition for the first time in history. To introduce our leader and the leader of the official opposition and the next Prime Minister of Canada,
There's a lot of work ahead. We all understand that. But when you see the energy in this room, when you feel what Andrea and her team have been able to create here in Ontario, we know what's going to happen here. We're going to build on what you accomplished last fall, add to the extraordinary team of women and men who have already been elected, and head into Queen's Park for the next government of Ontario. That's what we're going to do. We've never had to work harder, but that's the only formula and the only recipe for success. Adrian Dix is here. I heard him before. By the way, he's nobody's lounge singer. He's nobody who was warm-up act, and I'm definitely not Justin Bieber. But he is the next Premier of British Columbia, and we're all going to help him get there. Lorraine Michaels of Newfoundland Labrador, our wonderful leader there, who has built an extraordinary team that went and won the second highest number of votes in the last provincial election there, and they're headed for power in Newfoundland Labrador as well. You know, across Canada, decisions are being taken that are going to affect us for generations. Things are bad in Queen's Park, and you're going to have a lot of time to talk about that. But believe it or not, things are even worse in Ottawa right now. You know, Stephen Harper is not just cutting vital public services, he's cutting at things that Canadians rely on for their own protection. It's easy to talk about cutting civil servants, because when Stephen Harper does that, he's sending a coded message, and he's going after a public that the general voting population sometimes doesn't hold in highest regard. But those public servants are providing a public service. The whole pyramid of public administration exists to do one thing. At the very top, it exists to deliver a service. When you do have to work on your management side, it's not unusual to have to look at better management and other practices. But the very last thing you touch is the actual service to the public. What are they cutting? They're cutting food inspections. We had people die in Canada a couple of years ago. We had a minister who made jokes about it, who's still the minister, and now they're cutting back on food inspections. They're cutting back on aeronautical safety. What could be more important for the public? So again, not only are they bad public administrators, they're showing that they don't even have priorities in terms of public safety and public protection. We know what our priorities are, and we will always be there to defend the public interest. One of our biggest challenges in taking on the Conservatives in Ottawa and the other right-leaning parties across Canada is they're often benefiting from a certain branding as being considered good public administrators. Over the next couple of years, as we start taking on Stephen Harper in an even more detailed and structured manner, and we start defining him and his mistakes to the Canadian voting public as we prepare for the 2015 election, we'll start doing to him what he's always done to us. Let's take a classic example of what they're doing wrong. You know, when they emptied out, the Liberals and the Conservatives emptied out the EI account, and we were complaining bitterly about that, their answer was, well, you don't seem to understand public administration. It was public money before, and it's public money now, and stop worrying your little heads about that. Here's the reality of the emptying out of the $50 billion from the employment insurance account. It's a purpose-built account to take care of the predictable, cyclical nature of the market. We knew that there would be tougher times, like the 2008 recession, which was a bad one. So when that occurred, it was empty. What had they done with the $50 billion? It's not quite true that it didn't change anything. They created the fiscal space to give the $50 billion in tax reductions to Canada's richest corporations. Now, the Conservatives don't like it when we say to the richest corporations. Their answer is always, well, no, all corporations benefited from those tax reductions. That's not true either. Because if you're in the manufacturing sector here in Ontario or in Quebec and in the Maritimes, you probably weren't making any profit. Probably breaking even at best, and more often than not losing money. You had paid into the EI account for every single one of your employees, whether you were losing money or making money. That was an obligation that you were meeting. Every employee had paid into that specific account as well. But only the companies that were making the big profits, like the oil companies and the banks, were benefiting from the tax reductions. In other words, the companies that needed the help the most, the ones that were suffering from the Dutch disease that's setting in because of the way they're developing the oil sands, hollowing out our whole manufacturing sector, they needed the help. They could have been the ones holding on to and maybe creating jobs. The Royal Bank doesn't create jobs. They didn't get any of that money. Their money was taken and handed over to the companies that needed the help the least. That's not good public administration, and that's what we've got to start describing to the Canadian voting public. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, an American senator, had a lovely expression. He used to say that you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. That's something that we should remind Stephen Harper of. In the Insight case, the Supreme Court did something that I've never seen before. The Supreme Court admonished the Harper administration and told them that decisions had to be based on evidence and not on superstition or belief. Quite something, but that's exactly where we are with the Conservatives. You know, in the past 35 years, after-tax income in Canada has grown for the top 20%. But it has actually shrunk for the bottom 80%. In other words, this is the first time in Canadian history where we have seen generation over generation the middle class starting to lose. But more importantly, we will become the first generation in Canadian history to leave less to the next generation than what we ourselves receive. That, to me, as leader of the NDP, is totally unacceptable. How is it possible that in a country as wealthy as Canada, we still have hundreds of thousands of seniors living below the poverty line? How is it possible in a country as wealthy as Canada, we still have children going to school hungry in the morning? And how indeed can we show our faces on the world stage when we allow abject third world poverty conditions to continue on First Nations reserves like Ottawa's? You know, when the Conservatives withdrew our application for membership in the UN Security Council last year, they didn't do it because they were afraid we would lose. They did it because they knew we were going to be humiliated. And it's because the Canada that they're projecting onto the world stage has become largely unrecognizable to our foreign partners, and definitely no longer recognizable to ourselves. We've got to change that as well. That's not the Canada we built together. For those of you who are real political junkies, you know how to go online and find Hansard. I invite you to go back to last June, not going back to the dark ages. Last June, Jack Layton asked questions on June 7th and June 8th of Stephen Harper. Will you be cutting pensions? With his hand on his heart in the House of Commons, Stephen Harper answered, well, no, of course not. We have no intention to cut pensions. Jack Layton asked him specifically in those exchanges, will you be cutting healthcare transfers to provinces? With his hand on his heart, Stephen Harper looked across the floor at Jack and said, no, of course not. We won't be cutting healthcare transfers to the provinces. Last December, between the soup and the salad, Jim Flaherty looked over at his provincial counterparts and said, oh, by the way, we're going to be removing $31 billion in the projected transfers on healthcare. You know, 50 years ago, we decided, as a reflection of our fundamental goodness and based on the model Tommy Douglas brought in Saskatchewan, that no Canadian family would ever have to choose between having their sick child seen by a doctor and putting groceries on the table. That's a reflection of who we are. And those are the very institutions that Stephen Harper is dismantling one by one. Well, sometimes he'll put it off. He'll say this will be after 2016, which means that we really have to be concentrated on the date of 2015, because that's when we have to replace them.